So, probably the biggest debate that I've seen about Joker since it opened this weekend is whether or not there should be a sequel. And I know that Todd Phillips and Joaquin Phoenix were very adamant that this would be a one off DC Elseworlds film that would not turn into a sequel or a franchise or anything like that. However, as this film's box office has ballooned to the very top, and as it's been like the biggest opening for an R-rated film and the biggest opening in October, and it's been breaking records, and it's just getting this huge amount of people enjoying the film. It's gotten great word of mouth, and again, just a great box office. The chances of a sequel have gotten very high, in my opinion, even if no one's saying it has yet, especially since Joaquin Phoenix has kind of started saying stuff on talk shows about how he'd be interested in returning to this character and how it sort of became a dream role for him. And there's been talk that, we could get more Elseworlds films, and there's a lot of characters that I think they could do it with. Mr. Freeze, Two-Face, Scarecrow, Lex Luthor, Reverse Flash. There's a lot of these really interesting DC villains that could get solo, self-contained films a lot like Joker. However, if we're going to continue the story set up in this film, I have been thinking a lot about how they could do it, because I don't know necessarily that I'd be interested in seeing a continuation from the Joker's perspective. We've gotten his story, we've gotten his arc, and once you've completed a character's arc, making a sequel is fairly pointless, because Joker, at this point, and spoilers, if you haven't seen the movie, there's spoilers in this video, Joker has completed his arc. He is completely insane. He's really embraced his insanity. And, so what would the sequel do with that? He's insane. So the only option I see, if we're going to continue the story set up in this film, is we need to go to a different character. We need to see the events unfold from a different character's perspective and see a different character's arc. So I know that this might sound controversial, but Joker would have to be demoted to a supporting character. Now, I've heard people say, well, we could just jump over to Batman. We could have, we could see how Bruce Wayne becomes Batman in this universe. And while I do think that that would be interesting, I think it would be too much like Batman Begins. I don't know that we need to see it, and I think it would be somewhat uninteresting, and it would sort of just be a predictable jump, like that's what we'd all expect them to do. So if we're going to see a continuation of this version of the Joker, how could we do it? We need to jump to a different character, but what character could we jump to that would create just as interesting of a film as Joker? And I think that the answer is Harley Quinn. Now, hear me out, because I know that also may sound like a super obvious choice, and it may sound kind of underwhelming, but hear me out. The film, so if we're talking about a Harley Quinn film, it could take place maybe 10 years after the events of Joker. Joker's still locked up in Arkham, like we saw him at the end of this film. And we see a very slow burn film like Joker, where Harley goes insane, similar to Joker, but in a different context. And rather than being inspired by Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, it could be inspired by Silence of the Lambs. We could see a dynamic between Harley and Joker similar to what we saw with like Clarice and Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And it could be very inspired by that. And I think that would just be such an interesting film. We could see Harley start off as a very, competent and level-headed character. And as Joker starts getting into her head a little bit and starts manipulating her, we could see her start to kind of fall into the trap of empathizing with him and trying to convince people that he can be rehabilitated and that he's actually not as crazy as everybody thinks he is. And we could potentially see some stuff with Bruce Wayne. If it's 10 years after the first film, he'd be about 18 at this point. 18 to 20, and we could start to see Bruce Wayne maybe trying to find a way to help the city, to help, make criminals like the Joker, rehabilitated and try to help them in some way. And once he starts seeing that it doesn't work, we could start getting hints that he might decide to become Batman, that he has to work outside the law somehow to become Batman. I wouldn't necessarily want to see him become Batman in this film, though. I think, again, that the merit of Joker is that it was fairly uneventful. It was all about the character and not so much about the events that were actually taking place. I mean, the climax of the film is that Joker shoots one guy on a talk show. Like, that is insanely small scale for the characters that we're talking about. And so for this Harley Quinn film, I think that the ending would have to be Harley breaking Joker out of Arkham, and we could end with a shot of them like dancing or something as the news reports that Joker has escaped, and it could be an amazingly huge news story. And you could keep it still very grounded, and I think that it would just be such an interesting way to explore these characters further from a third person's perspective. We could be outsiders sort of looking into what's going on. We could see Harley Quinn's arc without needing to see, a very flat arc from Joker. And, I have a lot more ideas. I don't necessarily want to share them, though, here in this context. I've sort of thought out exactly how this film would play, and I really could see it being an amazing film. I think it would be an interesting look, and again, an interesting character study that would take some of the more interesting aspects of the comics and not necessarily need these huge action set pieces. It could continue the spirit of Joker, and I don't know. I just think that would be a really interesting film. So some of you may remember in my non-spoiler review, I talked about how I felt that there was a missed opportunity at the end of Joker, but I didn't want to talk about it, obviously, because it was a spoiler review. My only critique is that I think that the psychiatrist at the end of the film should have resembled Harley Quinn. I think that was just a missed opportunity. It's such a famous dynamic in the comics at this point. It's a newer dynamic from the animated series on, so really it's like from the 90s on. But it's such a famous dynamic, and I think it was sort of a mistake to not even have that final psychiatrist resemble Harley Quinn. I think that they should have ended before it's implied that he kills the psychiatrist when he says, "You wouldn't get the joke." I think it should have ended right there, and the psychiatrist should have resembled Harley Quinn. I think that would have been a perfect ending. But I also can see why that may have teased this potential sequel that I just pitched a little bit too much, so I see why they didn't necessarily do it. But those are my thoughts. Let me know in the comments below what you think about that, whether or not you think that would work. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.